Leila, I look at your revised forecast, and you get to trim that a little bit, but then the planned investments are pretty much staying stable. How do you reconcile the two?
Good morning, Yusuf. Thank you for the invitation. No, indeed, yeah. I mean, I think we have some good news as far as gas is concerned. And after a wave of capex reductions in the energy sector and a wave of forecasts where that have been reduced because of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and I think that's for a purpose, because this is a crisis where you have the highest synchronization ever and the deterioration of multiple metrics across the board. And one area where you definitely could see that is in the gas and petrochemical sector, given the nature of the products that we are selling from that sector. But here we are from the Middle East and North Africa. It's a region where, compared to the rest of the world, we have seen actually an increase in planned investments in the gas sector. And some of the drivers are definitely related to the continuation of increase in the gas demand in the region, and the fact that you will have, I think from the gas and petrochemical side, an increasing need for that. But there's also some strategic drivers that we want to capture in our report, and the fact that these players in this region want to position themselves in the next wave, in the next cycle of investments in the future.
And we see the Qataris doing that quite aggressively, because about 70% of planned investments up to 2024 are coming from Qatar. How much of that will come from non-state investors?
Right, that's another trend that we are tracking in our investments outlook, is the share of the private sector. And it's true that this year, let's say compared to last year, we've seen a small decrease, but there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that projects are becoming bigger. And you're right to mention the example of Qatar, but in other countries, and the nature of the petrochemical sector as well is being consolidated. And that's a trend that we have seen actually even pre-COVID, because of the low margins, the squeezed returns. There is a tendency to consolidate projects among themselves. And you can see today that the number of projects, for example, in the petrochemical sector, that is higher than, I would say, the $2 to $3 billions mark has increased. So that's one of the reasons why you would see a lower share of the private sector this year compared to last year. But however, I would not want to disregard the fact, and I think you have mentioned in your previous interview the case of ADQ and some joint ventures that are increasing in the region. I think there is a trend for a new way to monetize gas and petrochemical assets.
Sure.
So I would not disregard that in the next 2 or 3 years, you would see a return of the private sector because of the funding trends, the different funding trends that we are noticing in the region indeed.
So the Qataris also signed a big deal to sell LNG to China in the last few weeks, and that really set a new low price point that is very likely to see consumers react. Would you say that's an inflection point where more consumers are going to try and leverage what happened in terms of getting a better deal for themselves?
I think that's an excellent question, Yusuf, because I think you are tackling one of the key advantage points that gas players in this region, I would say oil and gas players in general in this region, can play with. Because if you look at some of the key success factors that these players are having, they have relatively high capital efficiency with some of the best return on average capital employed compared to the IOCs and the independents. They have relatively optimized supply chain. They have access to the lowest carbon assets, oil and gas in the world from that perspective. So the last, I would say, point on which they can have a level playing field with other players in the world is the issue of marketing and basically downstream market development. That's definitely a key point, especially when it comes to gas, because it's less liquid than the oil market indeed. So I think I would not probably call it an inflection point. I would call it a transformational point, because this is a time where cost curve will start to mean something. And when you have, I would say, the low cost, low carbon producers positioning themselves in increasing their market share. So how will the buyers react to that over the next 2 or 3 years? I think we still, especially when it comes to the gas market, where I think the recovery will be a bit longer than the oil market. So you will need at least 2 or 3 years for the buyers and sellers to position themselves in this.
I want to pick up on an important point, and that is the committed investments. You look at the top three. I'm looking at the table here, and Saudi Arabia is in that triangle over the next 5 years. But the question becomes, when will they produce enough to be able to start exporting?
I think the key question is how you monetize the gas, whether you export it or you consume it domestically. At the end of the day, a player should get where it has the most monetization for the fuel that it's producing. So if global gas prices are depressed and the netback gas pricing to Saudi Arabia, if I take that example, or Egypt or Algeria is low, it might actually make more sense to consume it domestically if domestic gas prices are high enough. So at the end of the day, it's really a balance between the domestic monetization of the gas, whether you invest in enough industries basically to diversify also your economy away from oil and gas, or you pursue an export-oriented strategy, but in that case, you are competing and you are competing against low-cost players that are investing massively in the next cycle and capturing, as I mentioned already, downstream markets in Asia, in Africa, and operating new markets. So I think the marketing race in LNG is going to become fiercer over the next 2-3 years, and I think for a player like Saudi Arabia or others, they have made progress in trying to become a portfolio player, but there is definitely a strategic question to be answered.